This week, I get photobombed, I rub out a whiteboard, and I visit the Millbank Tower. Hello and welcome to Mr. C History. Now it is July the 4th, 2024, election day here in the United Kingdom. So I thought this would be a good time to talk about British democracy, where it's come from, what it is, how it works, and ultimately what the future is. So let's go and have a look. Like many functioning democracies, Britain is founded on the principles of freedom, the rule of law, and accountable institutions. And those accountable institutions will form the structure of three things: the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. So what we're going to do is have a look at all of those institutions that make up British democracy, but we'll also have a little chat about elections, pressure groups, parties, and rights as well that really make up British democracy. This is the Houses of Parliament, our legislature. This is where the laws get made. This has been a centre of power here in Westminster since about 1016, when it was a royal palace, and then it developed and it evolved over time. And actually that's the real main point to make about British democracy. It has evolved. Unlike America and France, where there have been epic revolutions that brought it through, British democracy has bit by bit been added on, which is why we still have some odd sort of traditional elements to it, and maybe some things aren't perfect, but it's quite strong because of its evolution rather than revolution. Now, Parliament is bicameral. That means two chambers, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And the House of Commons is sort of just through there, a bit to the in there, a little bit hard to see from out here on the road. And that is directly elected, the House of Commons. 650 MPs, all elected by the people. Now, what role do they play? Well, the main one is they pass legislation. They will review it, they'll debate it, they'll discuss it, they'll add little bits on, and then they'll vote. And depending whether it might get passed or it might get failed, whatever the case, it gets that pushed through. We'll talk about the Prime Minister later, but it's obviously on one side of Parliament will be the government, the one that's won the election, with the Prime Minister leading it, and opposite that is the opposition, whoever that party might be. And it's presided all over by the Speaker of the House of Commons. It's quite an adversarial chamber. Modern parliaments are built in a bit of a horseshoe. This is not. You've got a government facing the opposite side with a mace down the middle, and they hang and shout, which is why the behaviour in there is pretty awful, and haranguing and shouting, etc. It's an adversarial environment. They also play a role in representation. Each MP represents a constituency of about 65,000 people, each one, and they play a role in making sure the government is accountable, questioning them, investigating them, etc. Now, the second chamber of the House of Parliament is the House of Lords, which is sort of in that little bit right in the middle of there a bit, and that is an unelected chamber. It's made up of about 900 or so members of the House of Lords, and they're appointed by the Prime Minister. Their main role is to scrutinise legislation that's been passed by the House of Commons. House of Commons can sometimes be too political, too adversarial. They might not get good legislation through, so they need the old wise owls to overlook it. They might be some specialists as well, like scientists, business in the House of Lords. Now, in recent years, the House of Lords has been given some criticism, saying it's undemocratic, it's far too big and bloated, etc. And the idea of House of Lords reform is definitely needed, is the view of many people. There are those against that who say, actually, no, if you did elect it, you would perhaps end up with just another House of Commons. There's just political infighting, and worse yet, you might end up with something like the US Senate. Behind me, of course, is Downing Street, the iconic home of the British Prime Minister. Now, this is the position that holds the executive power of the government of Britain, and actually this is another institution that has evolved and changed over time. Initially, Prime Minister was a bit of an insult, a bit like a teacher's pet. Oh, you're the King's Prime Minister. But over time, it's a position that's gathered a lot of power, and it depends really on your majority, how much power you have. But through the fusion of powers, this position can actually be quite powerful, because the Prime Minister both is the executive and also sits in the legislature, Parliament. So they can play a role in passing laws, but also executing, bringing them forward. So if they've got good control of their party, they're able to achieve an awful lot. One thing, of course, is though they have to command the confidence of the House. This means that if Parliament doesn't like them or doesn't have confidence in them, they can kick them out. Parliamentary sovereignty rules. So ultimately, what power does the Prime Minister have? Well, they are primus inter pares, first amongst equal in the cabinet. They command, they lead, they have the power to hire and fire. They're the ones who can wage foreign policy. They're not a head of state, they're not a president like in the United States, and they're not the monarch. Still though, very powerful.
Now, the sound was really bad here, but what I'm trying to say is this is a court of law, and for democracy to exist, there needs to be an independent judiciary or system of courts and judges. This needs to be free and independent of any political leanings, any biases. It can't be associated with any political party or individual or anything like that.
Now, Britain has a big system of local courts and various different rungs of all that, and that lasted for a long time, and the highest court in the land was the High Court and also the House of Lords. But in 2009 we got this building here, the new Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. This now is the highest court in the land. And this institution is still in its infancy, having been only created in 2009, but it's made rulings protecting people's religious rights, and also made a very significant ruling during all the Brexit debate, and it's backed up and determines the idea of parliamentary sovereignty. Yes, Parliament is the one that had to make the final decision. So it's doing its little bit here. It's very different from the American Supreme Court, which is inherently a little bit political, because the Supreme Court justices in America are appointed by the president. The Supreme Court justices here are appointed independently. The Prime Minister and the governing body doesn't have anything to do with it. Now, when it comes to elections in the UK, we have a one-person, one-vote system. You just vote once. In what is known as a majoritarian system, or we call it first past the post, which means that each person, each candidate in one of those constituencies, whoever is the first one past the post, whoever gets the most votes, wins. Now, people like this because it's pretty straightforward to understand. You just put an X in a box and that's it, and it can form strong governments that can govern. Well, let's see how that works. So imagine this is a constituency here, and the Labour Party will get, say, 35%, the Conservatives get, say, 30%, the Liberals get 25%, and then the rest goes to the other smaller parties. Now, in this situation, in majoritarian first past the post system, the Labour Party wins. They have the most votes. Woohoo, straightforward. The problem is, of course, is that 65% of this constituency did not vote for Labour. They voted for someone else, or whatever the case. So the Labour gets through without actually getting a full majority, getting over 50%. So there are more unhappy voters than happy, and this could cause a bit of a democratic deficit. And many critics of the first past the post system suggest a proportional system, proportional representation, where you would say if Labour is going to get 35% of the vote nationally, say, they should get 35% of the seats, and so on and so forth. It's more fair, it's more democratic. Critics of that would say, well, that means you don't have a very strong government. You have to endlessly form coalitions. Things don't get done, they break down, and there are examples of that worldwide. Who knows? Does Britain need electoral reform? This is the Millbank Tower on the Thames, and for many, many years this was the headquarters of the Conservative Party. And so it's worth talking about political parties here. Again, this is something that evolved over time. It's all about which side you sat next to the king or something like that. But nominally, Britain has a multi-party system, and indeed in the House of Parliament, the one that's just been dissolved, there were 13 different political parties represented. Normally, however, only really two parties can form a government, Conservative Party and Labour. Although, of course, the Scottish National Party, they governed Scotland, and indeed the Lib Dems were part of a coalition government, but really it's Tory Labour, isn't it? So these parties are all organised and they're funded, etc., and they put nominations up for each constituency in an election with the hope of getting elected to form a government with a Prime Minister to lead that party and the country. Traditionally, the Conservative Party has been on the centre-right ideologically, and the Labour Party traditionally on the centre-left. And there are some parties who are on the extremes of either side of those. And some people feel that these parties are too big, they're too broad, they don't really represent specific people, and they've broken away to pressure groups we'll talk about in a minute. But what's interesting, in recent years we've seen an increase in the number of political parties, but we've seen a drastic decline in party membership, which is a bit odd. One aspect of democracy is the idea of pluralism. This is the idea that many voices can be heard, which is why we have pressure groups, because sometimes these political parties can't have everybody. They're almost too broad to have some of the specific things, so we have pressure groups. And one good example of a certain group are trades unions, and this is Congress House on Great Russell Street, the headquarters of the Trade Union Congress. Now what they aim to do is they represent minority groups, women perhaps, or maybe even single issues like leaving the European Union or something, They are organisations that represent people who want this, and they lobby government and parliament to do it. This could be through funding or through putting pressure to pass various different legislation. Pressure groups are another way for people to join the democratic process. And interesting, in recent years, pressure groups are changing their identity a little bit. They've gone online and they've become more of a sort of social movement, #MeToo, the Black Lives Matter movement, and then broadening in protests through that way, through public movement, also comes under pressure groups. But there are also groups such as Just Stop Oil who take more illegal routes depending on your view as well. So pressure groups are an interesting line in democracy. Now, a fundamental aspect of a free society and democracy is protection of certain rights. And for that I've come here to St Mary's Church in Putney, where in the autumn of 1647 were the Putney debates. These took place in the aftermath of the English Civil War, the killing of the king, creating a new society, and they wanted it on the idea of a free vote, which we discussed, and also freedom of conscience, the freedom to practice whichever religion you want. Now, as ever with Britain, this has evolved into the freedoms that we all have today and the rights we have, from freedom of speech, freedom of expression, to freedom of assembly, freedom of protest, the right to form a trade union, and various different things like that. Essentially, the British government is not allowed to infringe on our rights. We have the right to walk down the street, we have the right to say what we want, we have the right to go on strike or to protest, we have the right to live our lives the way that we want to. This is something very, very precious and must be defended. Well, there you go, that's British democracy there. I hope you enjoyed it. As we progress further into the 2020s, unfortunately, democracy is under threat from external factors, but also internal in Britain and in many other democratic nations on earth. So it's something that is fragile, and it's definitely something that needs to be protected. So once you've subscribed to me, please make sure, if you can, go and vote. As always, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you on the next one.